Hello. Happy Tuesday. It's Tuesday the 13th of April, is that right? I don't know, I'm losing the plot. I expect you are too. All the days feel the same, don't they? Every day feels much like every other day. Today's been a busy day online in our house because we've had appointments for my children to see some of their friends at 2 o'clock and 11 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and a cello lesson at 4 o'clock. And now it's me, it's my turn at 5 o'clock. So here we are again. Another chapter of Saving the Unicorn's Horn we've got coming up today. As you remember, mirror image, sorry about that. We had the first chapter yesterday. This is, Joe has wound up in Viking times, and there's a girl there who seems very like Lucy, who he met in The Leopard in the Golden Cage. She doesn't remember him. Her name is Louisa. It's an Irish name, but her father seems to be Danish. Her mother's Irish. One way and another, Joe's quite confused. He thinks it's her, but she doesn't remember him, so does that even help if it is? Anyway, he hasn't got anywhere to go. He's turned up in this place he doesn't know at all, where he has no friends. And so he's asked her if she can help him out. And she sounds very reluctant about it. Okay, so chapter 2. Let's just look back. So she stopped, he says, "Please, Lucy, Louisa, whoever you are, I've just arrived and I have nowhere to stay. I know the dogs didn't like me, but could you help me, please?" She stopped walking and looked him up and down. There was a long pause. Then she said reluctantly, "I suppose so." Chapter 2. "But you can start by helping me. Here, carry this." The girl dumped her basket in Joe's arms. It was heavy. "What's in here?" He peered down into it. "What are these?" He picked up a berry and squeezed it between finger and thumb. "They're sloes. They're nearly over now. Those are just a few on the top. That's why I was late. I saw them on my way back here." "Back from where?" She looked at him as though he was an idiot. "Collecting firewood and checking the traps." She jerked her head towards the basket she was carrying on her back. "I was lucky today. There's a hare in here. There could have been 2, but the dogs weren't quick enough." She tugged on the leather straps at her shoulders, hoisting the basket further up her back. "And you're carrying crab apples, hazelnuts, and a few walnuts. There are some haw-berries too, if they're not completely squashed by the time we get home." Sounds like a feast. Once again she looked at him strangely. "Will I be able to stay at your house then?" Joe asked. "It should be all right. My mother will be pleased about the hare, so she probably won't mind having an extra mouth to feed this evening. If you're going to stay any longer, though, you'll have to make yourself useful, earn your keep." "Doing what?" "The usual jobs, of course." She tilted her head to one side. "Where did you say you'd come from?" "I didn't, but it's a very long way away." Joe found that he couldn't be bothered to explain again about his own world. It seemed so weird that she didn't know, when they'd been through all this before. He was absolutely certain that she was the same girl who'd become his friend at Fishbourne, and yet she clearly had no idea who he was. Perhaps he shouldn't really be surprised. After all, this was another place, hundreds of miles away, and another time too. Hundreds of years later, he guessed, if they were now in the Viking Age. All the same, he couldn't shrug off his disappointment that she didn't remember him. He'd been longing to see her again, but it felt as though he hadn't been important enough to her to be worth remembering. That wasn't true, he knew. Lucy had been so happy to see him each time he'd appeared in her world before. No, this must be something to do with the way the time travel worked. Nonetheless, it made him uneasy. "You speak Danish, though," she said. "What?" He'd been lost in his own thoughts. I mean, it might be far away where you come from, but it can't be that different if we speak the same language." Joe didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. Last time it had been Latin. Now it was Danish. But just like before, he felt as though he was talking normally, as he would to any of his friends back at home. "Anyway," she said, "we're here now." She pushed open a door in a building just like the ones Joe had been looking at earlier. He'd thought it was pretty dark outside, but it was darker still as Lucy closed the door behind them. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the gloom. He looked around. They stood in what he assumed was the workshop area, but it was empty of tools or materials of any kind. "My father's away on the autumn raids," Lucy said, following his gaze. "He'll be back quite soon. When he's here, he works as a cooper, like everyone else in this street." A cooper? Joe felt he ought to know what that was, but he couldn't remember. "Woodworking. He turns cups and bowls, makes buckets, that sort of thing. He closes the business when he goes away, then starts it up again when he gets home." "Is he away for a long time then?" "Yes, usually. 2 or 3 months in the late spring and early summer, and the same now. It depends how far they sail. If we have a chance later, I'll show you some of the things he's brought back. A lot of it gets traded straight away, but we keep a few things in case we ever need them." She dropped her voice to a whisper. "We even have a unicorn's horn." Before Joe could ask where the unicorn's horn had come from, or why you might need one, a curtain in front of them was pulled aside. The dog slunk immediately past the woman who stood in the opening. She wore a long woolen dress with a pinafore over it, like Lucy, and her hair was also uncovered. It was jet black. "At last, Louis-Jacques," she said. "I was starting to worry. Who are you talking to?" There was a clear Irish lilt to her voice. I should say at this point, this is much more like bedtime stories with your parents. I am not going to attempt the Irish accent because it will all go wrong. So you'll just have to remember that she has an Irish accent, Lucy's mother. There was a clear Irish lilt to her voice. Joe wondered for a moment whether she was speaking Danish with an Irish accent, or whether he was understanding Gaelic as well now. It didn't really matter, he decided. From the room beyond the curtain, the fire flickered. Lucy bowed her head. "I'm sorry I'm late, Mother, but it was a good day. There was a hare in one of my traps." She swung the basket off her back and hauled the animal out by its ears. Joe was surprised by how big it was. He'd never seen one up close before, only rabbits. "And I met this boy while I was out," Lucy went on. "He collected the nuts and apples with me." She gestured to the basket she'd given Joe to carry. Joe nodded, grateful that she was generous enough to pretend that he'd helped her. "He needs somewhere to stay tonight. Can he stay here?" Joe curled his fingers tightly around the handle of the basket, waiting for Lucy's mother to answer. All at once, he remembered how nervous he'd felt last time, standing in front of Lucy's mother at Fishbourne. In many ways that had been different. Helena Calvina had been rich and powerful, and he'd been presenting himself to her as someone he wasn't. This woman looked tired. She looked older than Helena Calvina, too. But then she'd clearly had a much harder life, without servants and slaves to wait on her. He looked at her as closely as he dared. She might be the same person. In any case, whether or not she was, it still mattered very much that she should let him stay. "Does he have a name?" the woman asked. Lucy didn't answer. Joe realised she didn't know. He'd said it, but only in passing. "I'm Joe," he said, wondering whether to add "Madam." It would sound odd, he decided. Lucy's mother nodded. "Short for Johannes, I presume." Joe didn't correct her. "I'm Aileen," she went on. "You can stay here for as long as you need to. My husband would want that, but you'll have to contribute to the household." Joe felt a stab of alarm. "I don't have any money," he said. Aileen stared at him for a moment, and then laughed. "I'm not expecting silver. You pay your way in labour. Food, firewood, water." Joe blushed. "Of course," he mumbled, holding out the basket of apples and nuts to her. At least this was easier, he thought, than the complicated story Lucy had dreamed up for him at Fishbourne. Lucy's mother took the basket and beckoned them both through to the room beyond the curtain. Sitting on a stool was a boy a little older than Joe, whittling something with a knife. A tall girl stood stirring a large pot which hung above the fire, while a younger one was picking over a basket of sheep's wool on the floor. "This is Joe," Lucy's mother said to them. "Joe, this is Peda, Sorka, and Anya." Seeing Joe's lips move as he silently tried to say the girls' names, she repeated slowly, "Sorka and Anya." She smiled. "Most Danes find those names hard to remember. They're Irish, like Luishak. The girls were named for me. The boys have Danish names like their father, Loki. My eldest, Matthias, is away with him now. It's his first raid." She spoke with pride, but Joe saw worry in her eyes. His own mother looked like that sometimes. He felt another pang of longing for her. She was so very far away. In fact, just now she was completely out of his reach, since he'd never yet managed to get back into his own time when he wanted to. He pushed the thought of her away. Aileen took the hare from Lucy and moved over to the fire, which provided the only light in the room. Shadows jumped all around the walls. "It should be my husband's last raid," she said, "as long as he comes back alive." The boy whittling on the other side of the fire looked up. "It'll be his last raid if he gets killed too," he remarked. "Don't say that," cried the youngest girl. The boy grinned. "Am I tempting the gods, do you think? He'll be fine, Anya. He's been raiding since long before we were born." Joe watched the boy. Peda, Lucy's mother had said he was called. From his voice, he could certainly be Lucy's 12-year-old brother from before, Petrus, though his hair was now blonde. Sorka, on the other hand, was dark-haired like Lucy, and looked very much like Lucy's older sister, Celestia. And the similarity between Anya and Lucy's little sister, Antonia, was unmistakable. He turned this over in his mind. It was the same, and yet not the same. Lucy was the same girl he'd known before, and her family seemed to be the same as before too, with names that were parallel to the names they'd had in Roman times. The absent Matthias must be Lucy's eldest brother, Marius, and her father, Loki, must be Lucullus. But the time and situation they were living in was completely different. In the Roman age, Lucy's father had been one of the most important people in the country, and they lived in a palace with hundreds of slaves to serve them. Here, when he wasn't overseas on a raid, her father was a woodworker, and they lived in a house which seemed to have only one room. Sorry, that seems to have dropped out. We've got a slightly dodgy connection today. I'm just going to backtrack by a sentence or so. In the Roman age, Lucy's father had been one of the most important people in the country, and they lived in a palace with hundreds of slaves to serve them. Here, when he wasn't overseas on a raid, her father was a woodworker, and they lived in a house which seemed to have only one room besides the workshop. There was someone missing too, Tiberius. Joe felt the hairs stand up on his neck at the memory of him. He'd hoped never to see Lucy's adopted brother again. Perhaps Tiberius really had gone, as he'd said he would. But Joe was still half afraid that the older boy would step out of the shadows with the same cruel smile and iron glint in his eyes. He looked all around, staring deep into the darkness at the end of the room, just in case Tiberius was there. The dogs were lying on the floor with their heads on their paws, watching Joe warily. But there was no one else. The room was long and narrow, and the walls were hung with drapes of some kind of heavy, dark material. In between, however, Joe could make out the wattle he'd noticed from the outside. It must be pretty cold in here in the winter. He wondered whether he would still be here by that time, and shivered. The floor was earth, trodden down hard and spread with rushes and straw. Above his head, all sorts of things hung from the rafters, bunches of herbs, a large ham, and a rack of what looked like very stiff fish that he realised he could smell, even through the smell of the smoke. There were all kinds of tools as well that he couldn't identify. Above the rafters, the inside of the thatch was black, and he could just make out a hole in the roof above the fire to let out the worst of the smoke. If it rained, the water must drip straight in. Other than the fire, with the pot hanging over it, there wasn't much furniture. Along the two sides of the room were wide banks of earth held in by low, wattle walls. Joe wondered what they were for. Near the fire, 2 planks rested on a pair of trestles, acting as a table, and there were several small wooden stools, like the one Pedder was sitting on. There was no sign of any beds. "Right, now that we're all here, shall we eat?" Lucy's mother had hung the hare by its ears from a peg on the wall, and began ladling stew into wooden bowls, which she set down on the table. Joe hovered, not wishing to be the first to sit down. Lucy was unloading her firewood onto the stack beside the wall, and Sir Lucia, Joe corrected himself, Sorka, had fetched a tall clay pot with a stopper and was pouring liquid into wooden cups. "You'll need something to sit on," Anya said, smiling shyly and holding out a stool to him. "Thank you." Joe took it, but still didn't sit down. "Anywhere you like," Pedder said, as though Joe had spoken his uncertainty aloud. "We don't set places for dead ancestors in this household." Joe blinked. He'd been afraid he might sit in Lucy's father's place, not in the place of someone dead. He sat. Pedder dipped his hands in a bowl of water and dried them on the cloth beside it. "Help yourself," he said, indicating the bowl. "And then there's stew." He pushed another bowl and spoon towards Joe. "And beer." Joe rinsed his hands and then took the cup Pedder held out. The liquid in it was dark. When he thought no one was looking, he sniffed it. "What's the matter?" Lucy said. "Don't you drink beer where you come from?" He shook his head. "My father has it sometimes, but people don't usually give alcohol to children." "What do you drink then?" "Water, normally, or juice." "You can actually drink the water?" Anya's eyes were wide. "Of course." "Doesn't it make you ill?" "No." Joe took a sip of his beer. It had smelled smoky and slightly sweet, but it tasted bitter. He hadn't really liked his dad's beer when he tried it, but this was much worse. He made himself keep a straight face, though, glad of the practice he'd had eating snails with Lucy the first time he met her. He scooped up a spoonful of stew. It was thin and greyish-brown, with lumps of some kind of vegetables floating about in it. Rather than look at it too closely, he put it quickly into his mouth. This time, however, he was too late to stop himself from gagging. He coughed to try and cover his reaction and stirred the stew around. The only thing he recognised for certain was leeks. There was something that tasted like carrot, but was greyish-white, and there were no potatoes and no meat. From the taste of it, there was no salt or pepper either. What the lumps were, he didn't know. Turnip, perhaps, though he didn't know what that would taste like. He took a deep breath and smiled at Aileen, aware that Lucy and the others were watching him. "It's a good stew," he said, taking another spoonful and managing this time to swallow it. "It'll be better in a few days," Aileen said, "when the hare is ready to go in." She smiled back at him. Joe began to eat steadily. If the food was going to be as bad as this every day, mealtimes were going to be an ordeal that he needed to get through as fast as possible. His stomach lurched as he remembered how, in Lucy's time before, He'd wished quite often that he could go home again. How was it that he always managed to forget that when he was back in his own world? The past was so much less comfortable. The food was weird, the beds were terrible, and several times he'd felt he was in real danger of getting hurt. And yet, almost the moment he got home, he wanted to come back. Perhaps that was what addiction was like. He sipped his beer, hoping to get used to the bitter taste of it. For the last 2 days he'd been trying and trying to get himself back into Lucy's time. Finally, he'd got what he wanted, even if it was Vikings rather than Romans. She was here, and he was with her. All he had to do now was to find a way to make the most of it. He just wasn't quite sure how. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. I have thought as I've written these books every time, particularly here actually, although it does happen later on again, later than you'd think. In Victorian times you get it again. I have found myself thinking how much I would not want to live then. The food must have been really quite terrible in Viking times. Meat was really scarce. They used to use the salt for salting things to keep, and so they wouldn't necessarily put salt into stews they were making. So very watery, thin, no potatoes, because potatoes came from the New World, from America, so they hadn't arrived here. So yeah, I definitely have come away with the feeling that I love to visit, just like Joe does, but I wouldn't want to be there. So yes, you'll find out more tomorrow, same time tomorrow, 5 o'clock tomorrow, what it's like in this world, how different it is to Roman times. It's hard not to think of history as being things getting better all the time, but actually that's not true. History sort of does this. You know, you get a bit of progress and then it goes backwards, and they get a bit more progress and then it goes backwards. And definitely between Roman times, certainly in cities that had been built by the Romans, there's a big step backwards into the Dark Ages. It's what we call the time around the Vikings, the Dark Ages. And at least it's partly that we don't know anything about it. So there we are. Same time tomorrow, 5 o'clock tomorrow, for chapter 3 of Saving the Unicorn's Horn. Have a good evening.